A loyal dog refuses to leave a woman's coffin, whimpering and scratching as if trying to tell the world something. Mourners assume he's just grieving, until a doctor notices something strange. The way he sniffs, the way he presses against the casket. It's as if he knows something no one else does. Then, the doctor makes a shocking discovery, one that will change everything they thought they knew about her death. What did the dog sense that everyone else missed? And how will the truth unravel a mystery no one saw coming? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Emily Carter blinked at her laptop screen, the words blurring slightly as she tried to focus. Her head felt heavy, like it was stuffed with cotton. She rubbed her eyes, chalking it up to another late night at the newspaper office. The morning sun streamed through her apartment windows, casting warm patches on the hardwood floor, where Max, her German Shepherd, lounged nearby. "Just need my morning pick-me-up," she mumbled, pushing back from her desk. Max's ears perked up as she walked to the kitchen, his nails clicking on the floor as he followed close behind. She reached for Max's food bowl, filling it with his breakfast. "Here you go, buddy." Max wagged his tail, but didn't dive into his food like usual. Instead, he watched her intently, head tilted to one side. Emily pulled out her favorite mug, the one with tiny typewriters printed all over it, and reached for the new tea blend she'd started drinking last week. The health food store clerk had raved about its energy-boosting properties. She dropped the tea bag into the hot water, watching it steep. Taking her first sip, Emily settled back at her laptop. The tea felt different today, scratchy somehow as it went down. She cleared her throat, but the sensation persisted. Max paced between her desk and the door, whining softly. "What's wrong, boy? Need to go out?" But Max just stared at her, his brown eyes worried. As the morning wore on, Emily's discomfort grew. Her hands felt puffy when she typed, and the room seemed to tilt whenever she moved too quickly. She pushed back from her desk, steadying herself against the wall. Grabbing her phone, she typed out a quick message to Lucas. "Feeling kinda weird today. Maybe coming down with something?" His response came quickly. "You're working too hard, babe. Take it easy and get some rest. Talk later." Emily tried to focus on her article, but the words kept swimming on the screen. By evening, her head was pounding. She stumbled into the kitchen, thinking some dinner might help. Max followed close behind, his tail low, whining more insistently now. "I'm okay, boy," she whispered, but her voice sounded strange even to her own ears. She reached for a glass of water, but it slipped from her swollen fingers, shattering on the floor. Water spread across the tiles as Max began barking frantically, circling her legs. The room spun violently. Emily's chest felt tight, each breath becoming a struggle. With trembling hands, she fumbled in her purse for her EpiPen. She'd always carried one due to a childhood allergy. But when she tried to use it, the mechanism stuck. She pressed harder, panic rising as nothing happened. Her legs gave way and she slid to the floor. The ceiling lights blurred above her as she gasped for air, her fingers clawing desperately at her throat. Her phone lay on the counter, just out of reach. Max pressed his nose against her face, whining loudly. He pawed at her arm, trying to help, but Emily could only watch helplessly as darkness crept into the edges of her vision. The only sound in the apartment was Max's frantic whimpering as he nudged her unresponsive body. The morning sun crept through the blinds of Emily's apartment, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. The usual bustling sounds of breakfast and coffee making were absent, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Max lay pressed against Emily's body, his gray muzzle resting on her chest. Every few minutes he would lift his head and nudge her hand with his nose, whimpering softly when she didn't respond. Across town, Claire Carter paced her living room, phone pressed to her ear. Emily's cheerful voicemail message played for the 5th time that morning. "Hey, it's Emily. Leave a message, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible." "Come on, Em," Claire muttered, ending the call. Her sister always answered her phone, especially during the work week. Something felt wrong. Her fingers trembled as she typed a message to Lucas. "Have you heard from Emily?" The response came quickly. "Not since yesterday afternoon. Stayed at my place last night. Everything okay?" Claire grabbed her keys, her heart pounding. The 15-minute drive to Emily's apartment felt like hours. She parked haphazardly, nearly forgetting to lock her car as she rushed inside the building. Her hands shook as she fitted the spare key into Emily's door. The apartment was eerily quiet, but a strong scent of tea hung in the air. Claire's footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor. "Emily," she called out. "Em, are you here?" A soft whine from the kitchen made her turn. Max sat there, his large frame hunched protectively over something. No, not something. Someone. Emily lay motionless on the floor, one arm stretched toward the counter above. Claire's scream pierced the silence. She rushed forward, dropping to her knees beside her sister. Emily's skin was cold to the touch. "No, no, no," Claire sobbed, fumbling for her phone. Her voice cracked as she spoke to the 911 operator. The paramedics arrived within minutes, their heavy boots thundering up the stairs. They worked quickly, professionally, but their grim faces told Claire what she already knew. One of them touched her shoulder gently. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your sister appears to have suffered heart failure." Claire stood frozen, watching as they prepared to move Emily's body. The door burst open again and Lucas rushed in, his face a mask of shock and grief. "Emily!" he cried out, moving toward her. A deep, threatening growl stopped him in his tracks. Max stood between Lucas and Emily's body, his hackles raised, teeth bared. Claire blinked in surprise. She'd never seen the gentle dog act this way before. "Max, it's okay," she said automatically, though something about his reaction nagged at her. The paramedics began moving Emily onto a stretcher. Max's growl turned to a high-pitched whine as he tried to follow. When they reached the door, he planted his feet, refusing to let them take her. "Max, please," Claire pleaded, tears streaming down her face. She grabbed his collar, having to use all her strength to pull him back. His claws scraped against the floor as he fought to stay with Emily, leaving long marks in the wood. The apartment door closed with a final click, leaving behind only silence and the lingering scent of tea. 3 days after Emily's death, the Henderson Funeral Home stood solemn against the gray autumn sky. Inside, the chapel buzzed with hushed conversations and muffled sobs. The overwhelming scent of lilies filled the air, their white petals a stark contrast against the dark wood of Emily's casket. Claire sat in the front row, her black dress wrinkled from Max's constant pressing against her leg. The German shepherd hadn't left her side since that terrible morning, except to pace anxiously between her and the casket. His nails clicked softly against the polished floor as he moved. "She was so young," whispered a colleague from the newspaper. "Who could have expected this?" "Such a shock," another mourner added. "She seemed perfectly healthy." Claire nodded mechanically at the steady stream of condolences, her hand resting on Max's head. The dog's ears twitched at every approaching footstep, his body tense and alert. When Mrs. Peterson, Emily's elderly neighbor, stepped forward to view the casket, Max suddenly stood. He pressed his nose against the polished wood, whining softly. An usher stepped forward to guide him away, but Max planted his feet firmly, refusing to move. "It's okay," Claire said quickly. He misses her." The afternoon wore on and Max's behavior grew more peculiar. He kept returning to the casket, sniffing intently at Emily's hands where they lay crossed over her chest. His whines became more insistent, drawing concerned looks from the mourners. Lucas approached the casket, his face a perfect mask of grief. Before he could get close, Max's demeanor changed completely. The dog's fur bristled, and a low, threatening growl rumbled from his throat. Several people gasped, stepping back. "Max!" Claire tugged at his collar, embarrassed. "I'm so sorry, Lucas. He's not himself today." Dr. Nathan Cole, who had been quietly observing from nearby, stepped closer. His weathered face creased with concentration as he watched Max continue to resist being moved from the casket. "It's remarkable," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "Dogs have such incredible instincts." Claire noticed how the doctor's eyes kept moving between Max and Emily's still form. He seemed lost in thought, occasionally shaking his head as if trying to piece together a puzzle. As the wake drew to a close, Claire stood to leave, but Max wouldn't budge. He sat firmly beside the casket, his eyes fixed on Emily's hands, whining with an urgency that made Claire's heart ache. "Come on, boy," she pleaded. "We have to go." Dr. Cole approached them quietly, his voice low and careful. "Claire, something's wrong. I think we need to take a closer look at Emily's death." Claire turned to him, confusion and uncertainty clouding her features. The seed of doubt that had been nagging at her since that morning in Emily's apartment suddenly felt more substantial, more real. The silence in Claire's apartment felt heavy as she sat curled up on her couch, a cold cup of coffee forgotten on the side table. Her mind kept returning to the wake, replaying every detail like a movie she couldn't stop. Max paced near the front door, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor, occasionally stopping to whine softly. "What are you trying to tell us, boy?" Claire whispered, watching him. The image of Max growling at Lucas kept flashing in her mind. She'd never seen him act that way before, not even with strangers. Her hands trembled as she reached for her phone. Dr. Hale answered on the second ring. "Claire, I was hoping you'd call." "Doctor Hale, what did you mean earlier? About Emily?" He sighed heavily. "She came to see me a few weeks ago. Said she'd been experiencing some unusual symptoms, swollen lips, dizziness. I suggested some tests, but she..." His voice trailed off. "Did she mention anything else?" Claire pressed, sitting up straighter. "I asked if she changed anything in her routine. She mentioned some new health kick she was on, but didn't elaborate." Claire's breath caught. "The tea. She started drinking this new organic tea." 20 minutes later, Claire stood in Emily's apartment, her hand shaking as she turned the key in the lock. The space felt different now, empty, yet somehow heavy with unspoken questions. Max pressed close to her legs as they moved through the darkened rooms. In the kitchen, Claire flicked on the lights. Everything was exactly as it had been that morning. The knocked-over glass still in the dish rack. Emily's laptop closed on the counter. Tears began rolling down her cheeks as she opened the cabinet where Emily kept her tea. "It has to be here somewhere," she mumbled, pushing aside boxes of regular tea bags. Her fingers found a metal canister at the back. Max immediately perked up, nose twitching as she brought it down. The scent that wafted out when she opened it was overwhelming, floral, but with an underlying sharpness that made her nose burn. Max backed away, whimpering. "It's okay, boy," Claire soothed, quickly closing the lid. She found a plastic bag in a drawer and carefully sealed the canister inside it. Her hands shook as she dialed Doctor Hale again. "I found it," she said, when he answered. Can you test it? See what's in it?" "Bring it to my office first thing tomorrow," he replied without hesitation. As Claire moved to leave, her eyes caught a framed photograph on the counter. Emily and Lucas smiled back at her, his arm around her shoulders at some beach they'd visited last summer. Something about his smile made her stomach twist uncomfortably. She turned off the lights, but hesitated in the doorway. Max sat beside her, ears forward, eyes fixed on the photograph in the darkness. His low whine echoed through the empty apartment, sending a chill down Claire's spine. Dr. Hale carefully examined the tea canister in his office, his weathered hands turning it over beneath the bright desk lamp. The morning sun filtered through his office blinds, casting striped shadows across his concerned face. Emily mentioned she'd been drinking this daily for about 3 weeks before. He paused, glancing at Claire, who sat rigid in the chair across from him. With allergies, sometimes the reaction builds up over time. Small exposures can accumulate till the body reaches a tipping point. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, trying to stay warm, despite the chill that had nothing to do with temperature. Max lay at her feet, his brown eyes fixed on the canister. "I'll send this to the toxicology lab right away," Dr. Hale said, carefully resealing the bag. "But Claire, these tests take time, sometimes several days." Claire nodded, her throat tight. "I understand. Thank you." Later that afternoon, she found herself back in Emily's apartment, cardboard boxes scattered around her feet. Max followed close behind as she moved from room to room, his nose working overtime, sniffing at corners and furniture. The task of packing up her sister's life felt overwhelming. In the bedroom, Claire's eyes fell on the leather-bound journal on the nightstand. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, settling onto the edge of Emily's bed. Max sat beside her, his head resting on her knee as she began to read. The most recent entries made her heart race. April 15th. Feeling off again. Throat weirdly tight. Should I be worried? April 17th. Lucas says I'm overthinking. Maybe I am. But something feels wrong. April 20th. New tea brand. Hope it helps with stress. The old one wasn't doing much. April 22nd. Max keeps pacing. Is he sensing something I'm not? He's acting so strange lately. A sudden growl from Max made Claire jump. He stood rigid, staring at the bedroom closet, his hackles raised. Claire's pulse quickened as she approached the closet door, her hand hesitating on the handle before pulling it open. The closet was mostly empty now, except for a few hangers and one dark jacket, Lucas's spare jacket that he kept at Emily's place. Claire frowned, remembering his words. I stayed at my place that night. Her fingers brushed against the jacket's material, feeling something solid in the pocket. Reaching inside, she pulled out a small, unfamiliar key. It was brass, unmarked, and definitely not one she'd seen before. Claire turned the key over in her palm, her mind racing. If Lucas hadn't been at the apartment that night, why was his jacket still here? And what did this mysterious key open? Max whined softly beside her, pressing his nose against her hand holding the key. The coffee shop buzzed with evening activity, but Claire barely noticed the other customers. Her attention was fixed on Lucas, who sat across from her, stirring his black coffee with practiced ease. Too much ease, she thought, for someone who'd lost his fiancée just days ago. I've started boxing up some of Emily's things, Claire said, watching his face carefully. Found her journal. Lucas nodded absently. She wrote a lot in that thing, probably full of work stuff. Actually, she wrote about feeling sick. She mentioned her throat getting tight, feeling dizzy. She had anxiety, Lucas cut in, his voice firm but controlled. She overthought everything. You know how she was. Max lay at Claire's feet under the small cafe table. His ears perked up at Lucas's voice. Claire took a slow sip of her latte, gathering her courage. Doctor, Hale is concerned about that tea she was drinking, she said carefully. He sent it for testing. Lucas's hand paused mid-stir. It was brief, just a fraction of a second, but Claire caught it. Then his face smoothed over, and he let out a short laugh. "You think T killed her?" He shook his head, setting his spoon down with a soft clink. "Come on, Claire. You're reaching." Mac's growl started low and deep, rumbling up from his chest. Lucas's eyes darted down to the dog, and he shifted his chair back slightly. "Could you maybe—" He gestured at Max. "Control him." Claire rested her hand on Mac's head, but didn't pull him back. "He's usually so good with people." Lucas cleared his throat, straightening his jacket. "Listen, I've been thinking. I should help sort through her things. Could I get the keys to her apartment?" Claire's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. The ceramic felt burning hot against her skin, but she barely noticed. Why this sudden interest in Emily's apartment, after days of avoiding it? "The police still have it marked as a potential scene of investigation," she lied smoothly. "They asked us not to disturb anything yet." Lucas' jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "The police?" "But they ruled it natural causes." Mac's growl grew louder. Other customers started glancing their way. "Maybe we should do this another time," Lucas said, standing up abruptly. "I have an early client tomorrow anyway." Claire watched him leave, his steps just a touch too quick to be casual. When she got home, she pulled out her phone and typed a message to Doctor. "Hale. Lucas is acting strange. I don't trust him." Sitting on her couch, she pulled out the small brass key she'd found in Lucas's jacket. Max rested his head on her lap as she turned it over and over in her palm, studying its unmarked surface. What was Lucas hiding? And more importantly, what did this key open? The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as Claire pulled into the Fitness Plus gym where Lucas worked. Her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel as she parked in a spot far from the entrance, choosing a secluded corner partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. Max sat alert in the passenger seat, his ears perked forward, dark eyes scanning their surroundings with an intensity that matched her own. "Ready, boy," she whispered, more to steady herself than anything else. Her fingers absently stroked his soft fur, drawing comfort from his solid presence. They waited until the morning rush died down, watching as the steady stream of gym-goers dwindled to occasional stragglers, before entering through the side door. Claire had been here once before with Emily, so she knew where the staff lockers were located. The hallway leading to them felt endless, each step echoing against the walls like a countdown. The smell of cleaning products and sweat hung in the air, making her nose wrinkle. Max padded silently beside her, his presence reassuring, his warm body occasionally brushing against her leg, as if to remind her she wasn't alone. When they reached the locker room, Claire's heart hammered in her chest so loudly she was sure someone would hear it. The key felt heavy in her palm as she approached locker 247, Lucas's number, the metal numbers slightly tarnished, but still clearly visible. She held her breath and slipped the key into the lock. It turned smoothly, with a soft click that seemed to echo in the empty room. Inside, the locker was meticulously organized. Typical Lucas, everything in its precise place. A gym bag, some protein bars, and a stack of papers caught her eye. Her hands shook as she pulled out the papers, and there it was, an insurance policy, buried beneath workout schedules and client forms. The document was crisp, official-looking, its corporate letterhead stark against the white paper. Claire's eyes scanned the details, and her stomach dropped, a cold weight settling in her core. The policy was for $500,000, taken out just 3 months before Emily's death. Lucas was listed as the sole beneficiary, his signature bold and confident at the bottom of each page. Memories flooded back. Emily mentioning Lucas's mounting debts over dinner one night, his stress about money during family gatherings, how he'd brushed off her health concerns in those final weeks with casual reassurances. The pieces started falling into place, forming a picture too horrible to contemplate, like a jigsaw puzzle revealing a nightmare. "Oh, God," Claire whispered, her voice breaking. "Emily." Max whined softly, pressing against her leg, his brown eyes full of understanding. Claire's hands trembled as she pulled out her phone and quickly photographed each page of the policy, the camera's flash seeming too bright in the dim room. The sound of voices in the hallway made her jump, her heart leaping into her throat. She hastily returned everything exactly as she'd found it, carefully arranging the papers in their original order, closed the locker, and locked it with trembling fingers. They slipped out of the gym unnoticed, taking a roundabout path to avoid the front desk. But Claire's mind was racing with implications and possibilities. The morning sun now felt too bright, too harsh, exposing truths she wished she could unsee. Once inside her car, she pulled out her phone with shaking fingers and dialed Dr. Hale's number, her breath coming in short gasps. When he answered, her voice was barely a whisper, thick with emotion and dawning horror. She didn't just die. Someone made sure she would. Dr. Hale's office was quiet, except for the soft hum of his computer. Claire sat across from his desk, her fingers twisted together in her lap while Max lay at her feet, his chin resting on his paws. The morning light filtered through Venetian blinds, casting striped shadows across the polished wooden surface between them. Dr. Hale cleared his throat, picking up the lab report. "The results came back," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "Claire, this isn't good. The tea contained extremely high levels of Brazilian nut extract, one of the nuts Emily was most severely allergic to." Claire's breath caught. Could it have been contamination during processing? Dr. Hale shook his head, his gray hair catching the light. "The levels are far too high. This was deliberate." He passed the report to Claire, pointing to a highlighted section. "See these numbers? This concentration couldn't happen by accident." Claire's hands trembled as she held the paper. The scientific terms blurred before her eyes, but the implications were crystal clear. She thought back over the past months, memories clicking into place like puzzle pieces. Emily started drinking this tea about a month before she... Claire couldn't finish the sentence. She kept having mild reactions, swollen lips, tight throat. We all thought it was stress or seasonal allergies. Her voice cracked. Lucas kept telling her she was imagining things. Dr. Hale leaned forward, his weathered face creased with concern. "And then there's the insurance policy you found, and Lucas's financial troubles." "The perfect murder," Claire whispered, feeling sick. "Make it look like an accident, like she just couldn't get to her EpiPen in time." Suddenly, she sat up straighter, her face paling. "Wait, what if she figured it out that night?" The words tumbled out as the horrible possibility took shape. What if she realized what was happening and tried to use her EpiPen, but... She couldn't continue, the thought too devastating. Dr. Hale's expression darkened. "We need to check that EpiPen," he said firmly. "If it was tampered with..." They gathered their things quickly, the lab report safely tucked into Dr. Hale's briefcase. As they stepped out of the medical building into the bright morning sunshine, Max suddenly stiffened beside Claire. His ears flattened against his head, and a deep, threatening growl rumbled from his chest, before erupting into fierce barking. Claire followed Max's gaze across the street. There, partially hidden behind a large SUV, sat a familiar black sedan. Through the windshield, she could clearly see Lucas watching them. Their eyes met for a brief, electric moment, his wide with surprise, hers with growing horror. Without hesitation, Lucas started his engine and peeled away from the curb. leaving a faint smell of burning rubber in his wake. Claire wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm morning. Max pressed against her leg, still growling softly in the direction Lucas had disappeared. Dr. Hale placed a protective hand on her shoulder. "He knows," Claire said softly. "He knows we're figuring it out." The streetlights cast long shadows across Emily's apartment building as Claire and Dr. Hale made their way up the stairs. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of their mission pressing down on them like a physical burden. Max padded quietly beside them, his nails clicking against the worn steps, his usual playful demeanor replaced by an almost solemn focus. Claire's hand shook as she fitted the key into the lock, fumbling twice before getting it right. The door swung open with a familiar creak, and the scent of Emily's favorite lavender air freshener washed over them. It was still there, lingering like a ghost, mixing with the musty smell of an unlived-in space. The scent brought tears to Claire's eyes that she quickly blinked away. Her throat tightened as memories flooded back. Sunday brunches with fresh coffee and warm pastries, late-night talks about their dreams and fears, shared laughter that once filled every corner of this now silent space. Max didn't hesitate at the threshold. He trotted straight to Emily's bedroom, his tail low but determined, his nose working overtime as he made his way to her bedside table. He sat there, looking back at Claire expectantly, his brown eyes filled with an almost human-like understanding. "He knows something," Dr. Hale said softly, following the dog's lead. His weathered face showed concern as he watched Max's behavior. Claire moved to the closet where Emily kept her emergency medical supplies, her heart pounding against her ribs. Her hands trembled as she pulled out the small red kit, the plastic cool against her fingers. Inside, nestled among bandages and antihistamines, was Emily's EpiPen, looking deceptively ordinary in its clear case. Dr. Hale took it carefully, moving to where the bedroom lamp cast the strongest light. His experienced fingers removed the cap, examining the device with practiced precision. His brow furrowed, deep lines of concern etching themselves across his forehead. "This doesn't feel right," he muttered, pressing the injector against the palm of his hand. When he activated it, only a small amount of liquid emerged, far less than what should have been there, the droplets catching the light like tiny crystals. Reaching into his medical bag, he pulled out a testing strip and touched it to the liquid, his movements precise and methodical. Claire watched as his face darkened, his jaw clenching tight. The muscles in his neck tensed visibly. "This isn't epinephrine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, heavy with the weight of discovery. "It's saline solution." The room seemed to tilt beneath Claire's feet as the implications hit her like a physical blow. A wave of nausea rolled through her stomach, and she had to steady herself against the wall. Emily had known something was wrong that night. She had reached for her EpiPen, trusting it would save her life like it had so many times before. But when she needed it most, it had been useless, deliberately made useless. The betrayal was almost too much to comprehend. "She was murdered," Claire whispered, the words hanging heavy in the quiet room, each syllable feeling like broken glass in her throat. Dr. Hale nodded grimly, his usual professional composure cracking slightly. "And now Lucas knows we're digging." Max whined softly, pressing against Claire's leg as if sensing her distress, his warm presence offering what little comfort it could. The apartment felt suddenly colder, darker, despite the warm glow of the bedside lamp. The truth they'd uncovered cast long shadows across everything, transforming Emily's peaceful home into something sinister, a crime scene they'd only now recognized. The cheerful photos on the wall seemed to mock them now, showing Emily's bright smile, forever frozen in moments of happiness she would never know again. The morning sun filtered through the Venetian blinds of the police station, casting striped shadows across the worn linoleum floor. Claire sat rigid in the hard plastic chair beside Dr. Hale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. Across the desk, Detective Ramirez's dark eyes moved methodically between them as they presented their evidence. Max's behavior changed completely around Lucas, Claire explained, her voice steady despite her nerves. And he kept trying to tell us something was wrong at the wake. Dr. Hale placed the lab results on the detective's desk, the paper sliding across the smooth surface. The tea contained concentrated amounts of tree nuts, specifically the kind Emily was severely allergic to. This wasn't cross-contamination. Claire pulled out her phone, showing the photos of the insurance policy. Lucas took out this policy just 3 months ago. $500,000, and he's the only beneficiary. She paused, swallowing hard. And then there's this. She placed the tampered EpiPen on the desk. Detective Ramirez picked up the EpiPen, examining it carefully. His expression remained neutral, professional, but his eyes narrowed slightly. He set it down and leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled under his chin. "This is strong circumstantial evidence," he said finally, his tone measured. "But we don't have direct proof that Lucas tampered with the EpiPen. It could have been a manufacturing defect." Claire felt heat rise to her cheeks. "But what about the insurance policy?" Her voice cracked slightly with frustration. Ramirez nodded, his expression softening slightly. "It's suspicious, no doubt. But we need something irrefutable." He spread his hands. "Something that directly ties Lucas to these actions." Claire's shoulders slumped. She had been so sure the evidence would be enough. Dr. Hale placed a comforting hand on her arm as they stood to leave. She could feel the anger building inside her, her fingers curling into tight fists at her sides. If the police wouldn't act yet, they would have to find the smoking gun themselves. The morning air felt cool on her face as they exited the station. She was about to suggest their next move when her phone buzzed in her pocket. The screen showed an unknown number. Claire hesitated, her thumb hovering over the answer button. Finally, she swiped to accept the call, lifting the phone to her ear. "Hello?" A distorted voice crackled through the speaker, sending chills down her spine. "Stop asking questions." The line went dead before she could respond. Claire stood in her darkened living room, methodically checking each lock for the 3rd time that night. The threatening phone call from earlier played on repeat in her mind, each remembered word making her hands shake slightly as she tested the deadbolt. She couldn't shake the menacing tone, the way the caller had seemed to take pleasure in her fear. Max paced near the front door, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor. His usual calm demeanor had vanished, replaced by an alertness that only heightened Claire's anxiety. His ears twitched at every small sound, his body tense and ready. Every few minutes he would pause to look at her with worried eyes, as if trying to communicate some unseen danger. "It's okay, boy," she whispered, but her voice trembled. Sleep felt impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, that distorted voice echoed in her thoughts. "Stop asking questions." The words carried a promise of violence that made her skin crawl. The crash came without warning, a sharp, shattering sound from the back of the apartment. Max's reaction was instant, his deep bark filling the space as he charged toward the noise. Claire's heart slammed against her ribs as she grabbed her phone from the coffee table, her fingers already dialing 911 as she ran after Max. Her bare feet barely registered the cold floor beneath them. Cold air rushed through the broken window, glass fragments glittering on the floor in the dim light. Through the jagged opening, she caught a glimpse of a dark figure disappearing into the shadows of the alley below. Max lunged forward, barking furiously, but Claire grabbed his collar. "No, stay," she commanded, her voice shaking. The last thing she needed was for him to get hurt trying to protect her. Her hands trembling, she scanned the apartment. Nothing seemed disturbed at first glance. The TV was still there, her laptop untouched. But then her eyes fell on her bag, now lying on its side on the kitchen counter. Her stomach dropped as she rushed over, already knowing what she would find. The manila envelope containing the copies of Lucas's life insurance documents was gone. Papers were scattered across the counter, but the crucial evidence had vanished. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Lucas knew. He knew exactly what she had discovered, and now he had taken back the only concrete evidence she had against him. All those weeks of careful investigation gone in an instant. Police sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Detective Ramirez arrived with 2 other officers, their flashlights sweeping across the broken glass and through the darkened apartment. As they took photos and dusted for prints, Ramirez pulled Claire aside. His face was etched with concern as he studied her pale features. "The intruder was gone by the time we got here," he said, his expression grave. "You said they only took some papers." Claire nodded, her hand buried in Mac's fur for comfort. The German shepherd hadn't stopped growling softly, his eyes fixed on the broken window. His protective stance made her feel slightly safer, but she couldn't stop shaking. "You're pushing someone into a corner, Claire," Ramirez warned, his voice low and serious. "People do desperate things when they feel trapped." He glanced at the broken window, then back at her. "Maybe it's time to consider protective custody." The morning sunlight streamed through the precinct windows as Claire, Dr. Hale, and Detective Ramirez huddled around a small conference table. Coffee cups sat untouched between them, growing cold as they discussed their next move. The break-in at Claire's apartment had only strengthened their resolve to find concrete evidence against Lucas. The incident had left them all shaken, but more determined than ever to uncover the truth. Dr. Hale leaned forward, his weathered face deep in thought, the creases around his eyes more pronounced than usual. "If Lucas tampered with her EpiPen, he might have done it before," he suggested, tapping his fingers on the table. "We need to check her prescriptions, past hospital visits, anything that could show a pattern." Claire's eyes widened as a memory surfaced, her heart beating faster. Emily was always organized about medical stuff. She kept all her receipts in a drawer. She turned to Ramirez, hope flickering in her expression. "We need to check her apartment again. She documented everything." 20 minutes later, they stood in Emily's bedroom. The space still held traces of her presence. A half-read book on the nightstand, a sweater draped over a chair, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. Max padded alongside Claire, his nose working overtime as he sniffed around the desk area, his paws making soft sounds on the hardwood floor. His tail wagged slightly as Claire pulled open the bottom drawer, the familiar smell of his former owner growing stronger. "Here," she said, pulling out a neat folder labeled medical. Her hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the papers, the rustle of documents filling the quiet room. Prescription receipts, doctor's visit summaries, and then, "Found it." Her voice cracked with emotion. She held up a pharmacy receipt dated just 3 weeks before Emily's death. An EpiPen refill, complete with serial number. Dr. Hale took the receipt with steady hands, his glasses perched on the end of his nose as he compared it to the tampered pen they'd found in Emily's emergency kit. His expression darkened as he studied the numbers, the color draining from his face. "They don't match," he said quietly, the words falling heavy in the silent room. The tension in the air grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Claire felt her stomach drop as the implications sank in, her hands growing cold. Emily had gotten a new EpiPen, but the one they found, the one that failed to save her life, was an older model. Someone had deliberately switched them, and they all knew who that someone was. "Lucas lived with her," Claire whispered, her voice barely audible, anger and grief mixing in her tone. "He had access to everything here. He could have easily swapped the pens when she wasn't looking. He watched her die, knowing what he'd done." Detective Ramirez examined the receipt closely, his trained eye catching every detail. "This is the evidence we needed. It proves premeditation. The question is, how do we get him to confess?" His jaw clenched with determination. Claire straightened up, a determined look crossing her face as she squared her shoulders. "We need to make him think he's safe. We need him to slip up, make him believe we've given up." Dr. Hale nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Let's set a trap. He won't expect us to be one step ahead of him this time." Max whined softly, pressing against Claire's leg as if sensing the gravity of their discovery. His brown eyes looked up at her with unwavering loyalty. The room fell silent as they all processed the weight of what they'd found and what they needed to do next. The path to justice for Emily was finally becoming clear. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the cafe windows as Claire sat across from Lucas, carefully maintaining a neutral expression. Her hands were wrapped around a warm coffee cup, more for comfort than thirst. Every muscle in her body wanted to scream at him, to demand answers about Emily, but she forced herself to stay calm. Max lay quietly at her feet, his presence giving her strength. "Thanks for meeting me," Claire said softly, letting her shoulders slump slightly. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately." Lucas stirred his coffee methodically, his eyes never leaving her face. "Oh?" There was a cautious note in his voice, barely detectable, but there. "Yeah." Claire took a small sip of her coffee, remembering Dr. Hale's coaching about keeping her body language relaxed. "I think I've been maybe a bit paranoid about everything." The tension in Lucas's shoulders eased slightly, but his eyes remained watchful. A couple walked past their table, their cheerful chatter creating a brief buffer of background noise. Claire let out a carefully practiced sigh, running her finger along the rim of her cup. "I just want closure, you know? The police said there's nothing suspicious, and I guess they're right." The words felt like acid in her mouth, but she kept her voice steady. Lucas nodded quickly, too quickly, his relief barely concealed. "Yeah, it's tragic, but sometimes these things happen." He reached across the table as if to pat her hand, but she subtly shifted away, pretending to adjust her napkin. She paused, letting the moment stretch before adding, "I was thinking of selling Emily's place soon, just to move on." She watched his reaction carefully through lowered lashes. Something flickered across Lucas's face, a flash of panic, maybe interest, before he smoothed his features into a sympathetic smile. "That's a good idea," he said, his voice carefully measured. "Fresh starts can be healing." Max shifted slightly under the table, and Claire felt his tail brush against her ankle. She knew he could sense the tension radiating from both of them, but he remained quietly vigilant, just as they had practiced. They finished their coffees in relative silence, exchanging only the most basic pleasantries. When Lucas finally stood to leave, his movements were lighter, more relaxed. He clearly thought he had won. "Take care of yourself, Claire," he said, his voice dripping with false concern. "Emily would want you to move forward." Claire managed a small nod, keeping her face carefully blank until Lucas had disappeared through the cafe door. Only then did she let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as she pulled out her phone. With steady fingers, she typed out a message to Dr. Hale and Detective Ramirez. He bought it. Now we wait for him to make a move. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Claire, Dr. Hale, and Detective Ramirez huddled around a small monitor in the evidence room. The clock on the wall showed just past 9 p.m., but none of them felt tired. They were too focused on what they might find, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. "If Lucas tampered with Emily's medication, we need proof," Ramirez said, his fingers moving swiftly over the keyboard, the soft clicking echoing in the quiet room. "We're checking pharmacy security footage from when she got her last EpiPen. This might be the break we need." The grainy footage showed the interior of Wilson's pharmacy, the black and white video casting everything in stark shadows. Claire leaned forward as a familiar figure appeared on screen. Emily, wearing her favorite blue cardigan, approached the pharmacy counter with that confident stride Claire knew so well. She looked healthy, normal, completely unaware that she had less than 3 weeks to live. Claire's throat tightened as she watched her sister sign the receipt and carefully place the new EpiPen in her bag before walking out of frame, her movements casual and unhurried. Dr. Hale placed a gentle hand on Claire's shoulder, offering silent support as Ramirez fast-forwarded through hours of footage. The timestamp showed 2 days later when Lucas appeared at the same counter. He wore dark jeans and a gray hoodie, looking casual but slightly nervous, his body language betraying an underlying tension that seemed obvious now that they knew what to look for. "There," Claire pointed, her finger trembling slightly against the screen. "Look at how he keeps glancing around. He can barely stand still." They watched as Lucas approached a different pharmacist, pulling out his phone and showing something on the screen, his movements too practiced to be natural. The pharmacist nodded and disappeared briefly before returning with a small box that would change everything. "Why would he need an EpiPen if he's not allergic to anything?" Claire muttered, her voice tight with anger and disgust. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk until her knuckles turned white. Ramirez nodded slowly, his expression grim as the pieces fell into place. Because he needed an identical one to swap it with Emily's. This was premeditated. The evidence was there on the screen. Lucas obtaining an EpiPen he had no medical need for just days before Emily's death. But even as Claire felt a surge of validation, she could see the hesitation in Ramirez's face, the careful way he watched the footage again. "This proves he got the EpiPen," Ramirez explained, running a hand through his salt and pepper hair. "But we need more. We need either a direct confession or evidence linking him to the tampered pen in Emily's apartment. Without that, it's still circumstantial." Claire clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms hard enough to leave marks. "Then we push him further. He's getting sloppy. He'll make a mistake." Dr. Hale and Ramirez exchanged concerned looks as Claire stared at the frozen image of Lucas on the screen, her determination hardening into resolve. The hunt wasn't over, but they were getting closer. She could feel it in her bones. The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as Claire stood by the apartment complex mailboxes, her heart pounding beneath her carefully composed exterior. She'd timed this perfectly, knowing Lucas usually stopped by around this hour to collect his mail before heading to the gym. Max sat quietly at her feet, his ears perked and alert, his brown eyes scanning the entrance with unwavering focus. When Lucas's familiar figure appeared at the entrance, Claire pretended to be absorbed in sorting through a stack of Emily's old mail, her trembling fingers rifling through the envelopes with practiced casualness. She could feel Max tense beside her, a low rumble building in his throat that she quickly silenced with a gentle touch to his head. The dog's reaction to Lucas had changed dramatically since Emily's death, and that spoke volumes. "Hey," she said, forcing a small smile as Lucas approached, his footsteps echoing against the concrete. "I was just cleaning out Emily's place." Her voice wavered just enough to sound natural, grief-stricken, though her heart raced with purpose. Lucas stopped a few feet away, his eyes darting between Claire and Max, never quite settling on either of them. "You sure you want to do that so soon?" His tone was concerned, but something lurked beneath the surface. Anxiety, perhaps? Or barely contained fear? Claire let out a heavy sigh, allowing her shoulders to slump, playing the part of the devastated sister to perfection. It's just... She paused, shuffling the envelopes in her hands, letting the paper crinkle loudly in the tense silence. There are some things I don't understand. I keep thinking maybe Emily knew something was wrong that night, like she tried to fight back. Lucas stiffened, his casual stance becoming rigid, and a muscle in his jaw twitched visibly. What do you mean? The words came out sharp, defensive, his composure cracking around the edges. Her EpiPen. Claire watched his reaction carefully, noting how his left hand twitched slightly, a tell she'd noticed during their previous conversations. The police think it might have malfunctioned. She kept her voice soft, questioning, as if she were simply sharing her concerns with a fellow mourner rather than laying a careful trap. Lucas shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she'd noticed before. Beads of sweat had formed on his forehead despite the cool autumn air. That's terrible. But... He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. I mean, that's not really anyone's fault, right? Claire narrowed her eyes, letting a hint of suspicion show through her grieving sister act. The mask she'd been wearing began to slip intentionally. Unless someone switched it. A laugh burst from Lucas's throat. Too loud, too forced, echoing unnaturally in the small space. His eyes had taken on a harder edge, like steel catching sunlight. You need to stop digging, Claire. The words came out as a warning, all pretense of sympathy gone, replaced by something darker and more threatening. Claire watched as Lucas walked away, his fists clenched at his side so tight his knuckles had turned white. His steps were quick, almost hurried, and she could see the tension in his shoulders beneath his expensive gym shirt. He was cracking under the pressure, each question adding another fracture to his carefully constructed facade. They just needed to push him one step further, and the truth would come spilling out like water from a broken dam. Detective Ramirez leaned against his desk, his expression grave as he outlined his plan to Claire. We need a confession, he said, tapping his fingers thoughtfully on a manila folder. And the best way to get that is to catch him off guard in a familiar setting. Claire's stomach twisted at the suggestion. You want me to wear a wire? Her voice trembled slightly as she stroked Mac's fur, drawing comfort from his solid presence beside her. Not exactly, Ramirez explained. We'll set up surveillance equipment in Emily's apartment. Small cameras, high-quality audio. You'll have a backup recording device, just in case. He paused, studying her face. But I won't sugarcoat this. It could be dangerous. Claire took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. Emily deserves justice. The next day, Claire watched nervously as technicians installed tiny cameras throughout Emily's apartment. They worked quickly and efficiently, hiding the equipment behind photo frames and inside potted plants. Max observed from his corner, his brown eyes following their movements with interest. When Lucas arrived, Claire was already sorting through a box of Emily's books. Thanks for coming, she said softly, carefully maintaining her vulnerable facade. There's just so much to go through. Lucas nodded, picking up a framed photo of Emily. Of course, whatever you need. They worked in silence for a while, the tension building like a thunderstorm. Claire waited until Lucas seemed relaxed, absorbed in folding Emily's sweaters. The police called yesterday, she mentioned casually, though her heart hammered in her chest. Lucas's hand stilled. Oh, they're reopening the case. Claire kept her voice steady, watching his reflection in the window. Something about her medication being tampered with. That's ridiculous. The words came out sharp, defensive. Claire turned to face him, letting her genuine grief show through. I wish I knew what happened that night. She blinked back tears, not all of them feigned. I keep thinking, what if someone had a reason to... Emily was weak. Lucas suddenly exploded, his careful composure shattering. She panicked over everything. She never even needed that damn EpiPen most of the time. Claire's breath caught in her throat as Lucas stepped closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. She always overreacted. It wasn't supposed to be that bad. From his corner, Max let out a low, threatening growl. Claire's fingers trembled as they pressed against the recording device in her pocket, but she kept her face carefully composed. Lucas had just admitted his involvement. They finally had him. Claire hurried out of Emily's apartment, her heart pounding against her ribs as she clutched the recording device in her trembling hands. Max padded silently beside her, his protective presence steadying her nerves. The evening air felt cool against her flushed face as she approached the unmarked police car parked half a block away, its dark silhouette barely visible in the growing dusk. Detective Ramirez and Dr. Hale sat inside, their faces tense with anticipation. The street light cast shadows across their features as Claire slipped into the back seat, her fingers fumbling with the device. "We got it," she whispered, her voice shaky but triumphant. Max settled at her feet, his warm body pressed reassuringly against her legs. Ramirez connected the device to a small speaker, and Lucas's damning words filled the car's interior. They listened in heavy silence as his confession played out, his frustration clear in every bitter word, his calculated plan revealed in his defensive justification. The recording captured everything: his admission of tampering with the EpiPen, his belief that Emily would only have a mild reaction, the underlying current of anger when things went wrong. Claire's stomach churned as she heard the cold calculation in his voice, the way he spoke about Emily as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. "He didn't expect her to die," Dr. Hale murmured, his face pale in the dim light. "He thought he could control it." His hands clenched and unclenched in his lap, betraying his distress. Detective Ramirez ran a hand over his face, exhaling slowly. His years of experience showed in the careful way he considered their next move. "The recording is good, really good. But we need one more thing to make this airtight. We need a physical link between Lucas and the tampered EpiPen." "What about his fingerprints?" Dr. Hale suggested, leaning forward in his seat, the leather creaking beneath him. Claire's mind raced through possibilities, her analytical skills sharpening with purpose. "The pharmacy footage shows him getting that second EpiPen," she said, her voice growing stronger as the pieces connected. "If we can find the original one he swapped out, then we can tie it directly to him," Ramirez finished, his fingers tapping thoughtfully against the dashboard. "His prints would be all over it." A determined look crossed his weathered features. Claire turned to look back at Emily's apartment building, where warm light still glowed from her sister's windows. The sight made her heart ache with a mixture of grief and determination. Lucas was still inside, sorting through Emily's belongings, completely unaware that his carefully constructed plan was about to crumble. They just needed to find that missing piece, and Claire knew in her heart that Emily would help them find it, even now. Claire, Dr. Hale, and Detective Ramirez slipped quietly back into Emily's apartment. The evening shadows stretched across the familiar space, making everything look different, almost eerie. The fading sunlight cast long, dark fingers across the walls, transforming everyday objects into mysterious silhouettes. Max padded ahead of them, his nose already working, searching, his body tense with concentration. "We need to be thorough but quick," Ramirez whispered, pulling on latex gloves with practiced precision. "Lucas could return at any moment. We can't risk him catching us here." Claire's hands trembled as she started searching through Emily's desk drawers. Every rustle of paper, every creak of wood made her heart jump. The sound of her own breathing seemed too loud in the quiet apartment. Dr. Hale methodically checked the kitchen cabinets while Ramirez examined the bathroom, their movements careful and deliberate. Max moved with purpose through the apartment, his nails clicking softly on the hardwood floors. His ears perked forward, body language alert and focused. Suddenly, he stopped at Emily's bedside table, his tail straight and alert. He pawed at the bottom drawer, whining softly, his behavior growing more insistent. Claire crossed the room quickly, her breath catching in her throat. "He found something." Her fingers shook as she carefully pulled open the drawer, the wood sliding smoothly on its tracks. Inside, beneath a scatter of old receipts and papers, a small Ziploc bag caught her eye. Her heart thundered in her chest as she gently lifted it out, afraid it might crumble in her trembling hands. "Doctor Hale," she called softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Look at this." Dr. Hale hurried over, taking the bag carefully in his gloved hands. Inside was an EpiPen, unused and intact, its yellow casing unmarred. He examined the serial number closely, comparing it to the pharmacy receipt they had found earlier. His eyes widened, recognition flooding his face. "This matches the number from her prescription. This is the original one." Ramirez quickly joined them, pulling an evidence bag from his pocket. If Lucas handled this when he swapped it out, his fingerprints should still be on it. He carefully placed the Ziploc bag and its contents into the evidence bag, sealing it with practiced efficiency, making sure not to compromise any potential evidence. Claire leaned against the bedside table, her legs suddenly weak with relief. The pieces had finally come together like a completed puzzle. They had Lucas's damning words on the recording. They had footage of him obtaining the second EpiPen from the pharmacy. And now they had the original EpiPen he had switched out, potentially covered with his fingerprints. The evidence was mounting, becoming impossible to ignore. "It's over," she whispered, reaching down to scratch behind Mac's ears, feeling his warm fur beneath her fingers. "We've got him." The evening settled over the city like a heavy blanket, bringing with it an unsettling quiet. Claire sat on her living room couch, Max's warm body pressed against her leg, both of them waiting in tense silence. Across town, Detective Ramirez and his team were preparing to arrest Lucas, armed with the evidence they'd gathered. Claire's fingers absently stroked Mac's fur, finding comfort in his steady presence. The German shepherd's ears remained alert, his dark eyes fixed on the front door. Every tiny sound made Claire jump. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of traffic, the whisper of wind against the windows. Her phone buzzed suddenly on the coffee table, making her heart leap. An unknown number flashed across the screen. With trembling fingers, she opened the message. "You should have left it alone." The words sent ice through her veins. Max lifted his head, sensing her distress. Before she could process the threat, a loud crash echoed from outside. Max exploded into fierce barking, jumping to his feet and racing to the window. His hackles raised, teeth bared as he growled deep in his throat. Claire's pulse hammered in her ears as she crept to the window. Pulling back the curtain just slightly, she peered out into the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat. There, across the street, sat Lucas's silver sedan, its headlights dark. The street light cast just enough glow to make out its familiar shape. Her phone rang, making her jump. Ramirez's name flashed on the screen. "Claire." His voice was tight with urgency. "We went to his place. He's gone." The words hit her like a physical blow. She watched the car across the street, her hand gripping the phone so tight her knuckles turned white. "He's here," she whispered. "Outside my apartment." "Lock your doors. We're on our way. Don't—" A sharp click cut through the air, the sound of her back door handle turning. Max whirled toward the noise, his barking becoming more aggressive. Claire's stomach twisted as she realized Lucas wasn't just watching anymore. He was making his move. She reached down and gripped Mac's collar, feeling the dog's muscles bunched and ready. The fear that had haunted her since Emily's death suddenly crystallized into something else: determination. She wasn't going to let Lucas win. Not again. "Come and get me, you coward," she muttered under her breath, her voice steady despite her racing heart. She wasn't afraid anymore. The night pressed against the windows like a dark curtain as Claire methodically moved through her apartment, checking every lock. Her hands trembled slightly, but her movements were deliberate and focused. Max shadowed her steps, his nails clicking on the hardwood floor, muscles tense and ready. After securing the last window, Claire pulled out her phone and dialed Ramirez. Her voice was surprisingly steady when he answered. "If he's watching me, he'll make a move soon." "We're 5 minutes out," Ramirez assured her. "Just stay." A distinct crunch of leaves from the backyard cut through the silence. Max's head snapped toward the sound, a low growl rumbling in his chest. Claire's heart pounded as she crept toward the kitchen, her fingers wrapping around the handle of a large knife. The back door creaked, wood groaning against wood. Claire held her breath, gripping the knife tighter as a shadow filled the doorway. Lucas stepped into her kitchen, his familiar face now twisted with something dark and desperate. His eyes locked onto the knife in her hand, then darted to Max, whose growl had grown deeper. "You ruined everything!" Lucas spat, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Claire planted her feet firmly, keeping the kitchen island between them. "You did that yourself," she replied, her voice clear and unwavering despite her racing heart. Lucas took a step forward, his hands clenching into fists. Before he could move closer, Max exploded into action. The German Shepherd launched himself forward, powerful jaws snapping at Lucas's arm. Lucas jerked back with a startled cry, but Max pressed forward, forcing him to retreat. Lucas stumbled, crashing into one of the kitchen chairs. It toppled with a loud clatter, the sound nearly drowned out by Max's fierce barking. In the distance, police sirens began to wail, growing louder with each second. Panic flashed across Lucas's face. He scrambled to his feet and bolted toward the front door, desperation driving him forward. But as he yanked the door open, he found himself staring down the barrels of several police weapons. Detective Ramirez stood at the center, his gun steady, his expression grim. "On the ground! Now!" Ramirez barked. 2 officers tackled Lucas before he could react, forcing him face down onto the porch. The metallic click of handcuffs echoed in the sudden quiet. Ramirez holstered his weapon and turned to Claire, who stood in the doorway, with Max still positioned protectively in front of her. "You're safe now," he said softly. Claire looked down at Max, reaching out to touch his fur with still trembling fingers. "Thanks to him," she whispered, as the loyal dog pressed closer to her side, his mission to protect finally complete. In the stark interrogation room, fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across Lucas's face, highlighting every twitch and tremor that betrayed his nervousness. His hands, bound by metal cuffs, rested on the cold steel table, fingers drumming an erratic rhythm against the surface. His previously confident facade had crumbled completely, leaving behind a man who looked smaller, diminished, almost childlike in his fear. Detective Ramirez sat across from him, his expression carefully unreadable as he arranged the evidence files with deliberate slowness, each paper sliding into place with a soft whisper. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken accusations and the weight of betrayal. Lucas's leg bounced nervously under the table, creating a steady thump that echoed in the confined space. His eyes darted between the door and the two-way mirror like a trapped animal searching for escape. The weight of what he'd done seemed to press down on his shoulders, making him hunch forward as if trying to disappear into himself. Ramirez finally leaned in, his voice steady and controlled, each word measured and precise. "You swapped out Emily's EpiPen. You knew she was allergic to tree nuts, and you made sure her only way to save herself wouldn't work. You watched her trust you day after day, believing that device would protect her." Lucas' lip curled into a sneer, but his voice wavered slightly, cracking on the edges of his words. "You have no proof of that. You're just guessing." With calculated precision, Ramirez slid the EpiPen across the table's smooth surface, the fluorescent lights glinting off its plastic casing. It stopped directly in front of Lucas, who flinched as if it might burn him, his handcuffs jingling with the sudden movement. "Your fingerprints are all over this. Every single print tells the story of what you did." The color drained from Lucas's face, leaving him ashen and sickly under the harsh lighting. Beads of sweat formed on his forehead as his eyes fixed on the device that had sealed Emily's fate, unable to look away from the evidence of his betrayal. His jaw worked back and forth, teeth clenching as the reality of his situation became impossible to deny. The facade of innocence he'd maintained for weeks cracked and fell away, like a poorly constructed mask. After what felt like an eternity, Lucas released a shaky breath that seemed to deflate his entire body. His shoulders slumped in defeat, the fight draining out of him all at once. "I didn't mean for her to die," he whispered, his voice barely audible in the quiet room. I needed the money. It wasn't supposed to go this far." Ramirez's eyes narrowed, disgust evident in his expression as he studied the broken man before him. "And you let her suffer. You watched her struggle to breathe, knowing exactly why it was happening." Lucas's posture crumpled completely, like a puppet with cut strings. He slumped back in the metal chair, the handcuffs rattling against the table, in a final damning chorus. The case was closed. Emily would finally get justice, though the price had been far too high. The courtroom buzzed with quiet tension as Lucas shuffled in, his orange jumpsuit a stark contrast to the polished wood and somber faces. His wrists and ankles were bound in chains that clinked with each hesitant step, the sound echoing off the high ceiling. Claire sat rigid in the front row, her fingers wrapped tightly around Mac's leash as the German shepherd watched Lucas with unwavering attention, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The gallery was packed with familiar faces, Emily's colleagues from the newspaper, old friends from college, and family members who had flown in from across the country. Some dabbed at their eyes with tissues, while others stared ahead with determined expressions. Dr. Hale sat beside Claire, his normally cheerful face set in grim determination, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Detective Ramirez stood near the back, arms crossed, watching the proceedings with professional detachment, though the slight clenching of his jaw betrayed his emotions. When Lucas pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and medical tampering, his voice cracked and wavered. He didn't look at anyone, keeping his eyes fixed on the floor, his shoulders hunched forward in defeat. The judge's voice filled the courtroom steady and clear as she detailed his crimes, the deliberate tampering with Emily's medication, the calculated plan to profit from her death, the cold-blooded betrayal of trust. Each word seemed to hang in the air like a weight. The sentence came down like a thunderclap. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Claire released a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding, her whole body trembling with relief. Beside her, Mac's tail thumped once against the floor, as if he too understood the significance of the moment. A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. After the courtroom cleared, Claire drove to the cemetery, the late afternoon sun painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Long shadows stretched across the rows of headstones as she walked the familiar path to Emily's grave, Max padding faithfully beside her, his paws silent on the manicured grass. The white marble headstone gleamed softly, Emily's name etched in elegant letters, a gentle breeze stirring the fresh flowers left by other visitors. Claire knelt before the grave, laying a single white rose against the cool stone, its petals perfect and unblemished. Max settled beside her, his warm presence a comfort in the quiet solitude of the cemetery, his brown eyes watching her with understanding. Her fingers traced the letters of Emily's name as tears welled in her eyes, each curve and line a reminder of the sister she'd lost. "We did it, Em," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You weren't alone. We found the truth." Max whined softly and pressed his nose against her hand, offering comfort in the way only he could. Claire scratched behind his ears, grateful for his unwavering loyalty throughout their journey for justice, remembering all the late nights and difficult moments he'd helped her through. She wiped away a tear that had escaped down her cheek, feeling both drained and somehow lighter. It was over. The investigation, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it had finally come to an end. But Emily's legacy wasn't finished, not by a long shot. Her story would continue to make a difference, just as she had always wanted. Weeks melted into one another as Claire navigated her new normal. The apartment felt less empty with Max's steady presence, his gentle paw steps on the hardwood floors, his soft breathing as he dozed in patches of sunlight, his watchful eyes following her movements. On difficult mornings when grief hit particularly hard, he would rest his head on her lap, offering silent comfort that meant more than any words could. Late one night, unable to sleep, Claire found herself scrolling through medical websites. The statistics shocked her. Thousands of deaths annually from severe allergic reactions, many preventable with proper awareness and treatment. Her screen blurred as tears welled in her eyes, thinking of Emily gasping for breath alone in her apartment, betrayed by the one person she should have been able to trust. Dr. Hale's suggestion to channel her pain into purpose sparked something in Claire. She spent days drafting proposals, making calls, and meeting with medical professionals. The Emily Carter Allergy Awareness Fund took shape, its mission clear: to prevent others from suffering Emily's fate. The Foundation's first initiative focused on providing free allergy testing in underserved communities. Dr. Hale volunteered his expertise, helping to coordinate with local clinics and hospitals. They created educational programs about recognizing allergic reactions and the importance of properly maintained emergency medication. Local news stations picked up the story. Claire's interviews always included Emily's photo, her bright smile frozen in time, and the tragic circumstances that led to the Foundation's creation. Each time she shared Emily's story, more people came forward with their own experiences of close calls and lost loved ones. The Foundation's opening ceremony filled the community center's main hall. Supporters, medical professionals, and families affected by severe allergies gathered, creating a buzz of passionate conversation. Max sat beside Claire at the podium, his posture regal and attentive as always. Claire's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. She looked out at the sea of faces, then down at Max, drawing strength from his unwavering presence. Her voice started soft, but grew stronger with each word. "My sister Emily was a fighter for truth," she began. "She believed in exposing injustice and giving voice to those who couldn't speak for themselves. Today, we continue her fight in a different way." She reached down to scratch Max's ears, earning an appreciative tail wag. "Because of one loyal dog, the truth was uncovered. Because of Emily's story, lives will be saved." The applause thundered through the hall, many rising to their feet. Max's tail thumped against the stage floor, his eyes bright and alert, as if he knew exactly what his role had been in bringing justice and meaning to Emily's death. 1 year had passed since the Foundation's launch. The autumn breeze rustled through the park's trees, scattering golden leaves across the path where Claire walked with Max. His service vest, emblazoned with the Emily Carter Allergy Awareness Fund logo, caught the morning light. People smiled and nodded as they passed, some recognizing them from local news coverage. Life had settled into a different rhythm now. The sharp edges of grief had softened, though Claire still felt Emily's absence every day. But there was purpose in the pain, meaning in the memory. The foundation had already helped hundreds of families access proper allergy testing and education. Max trotted beside her, his gray muzzle showing hints of white, but his step still steady and sure. He'd adapted well to his new role as the foundation's mascot, visiting schools and clinics where children delighted in petting him while learning about allergy awareness. At their favorite cafe, Dr. Hale waited at their usual corner table. His kind eyes crinkled as he watched them approach. Max settled at Claire's feet while she ordered her usual tea. Careful now to always check the ingredients, a habit born from tragedy. The latest numbers came in, Dr. Hale said, sliding a folder across the table. We've screened over 500 children this month alone. 3 cases of severe allergies identified early. Claire nodded, warmth spreading through her chest. 3 families who won't go through what we did. Emily would have been proud, Dr. Hale said softly, his voice carrying the weight of shared memories. Claire smiled, reaching into her pocket. Yeah, she would have. She pulled out a small silver pendant, turning it over in her hands. The paw print design caught the light, Emily's initials, E.C., delicately engraved within its borders. With gentle fingers, she fastened it to Max's collar, right beside his service tags. He lifted his head, watching her with those understanding brown eyes that had seen through Lucas's lies and led them to the truth. You saved us, she whispered, scratching behind his ears. Max leaned into her touch, his tail thumping softly against the floor. As they prepared to leave the cafe, Max suddenly straightened, his tail beginning to wag. Claire followed his gaze through the window, where the morning sky had erupted in brilliant shades of pink and gold. The sunrise painted the world in warm, hopeful light, promising a new day, a new beginning, a new life. And in that moment, as Max pressed against her leg and the sun rose higher, Claire felt Emily's memory carried forward in every life they touched, in every child they helped, in every sunrise they witnessed together. If you enjoyed the story of Emily and Max, I handpicked this next story that you will love. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.